Welcome to Exit Paradox, where we explore what actually happens after a successful business exit. I'm your host, Anastasia Koroleva.
Many of the folks that we work with in first generation wealth, their children don't have to work. And yet the skills that they're learning is more important than the money they're earning.
Today's episode is different. My guest isn't an exited founder, but she's someone we all need. Amy Castoro helps families have honest conversations about wealth, the kind most of us were never taught to have. She shares practical tools from her firm's 50 years of experience advising some of the wealthiest families in America. Her work focuses on the emotional side of money, how we build trust, protect our closest relationships, speak openly, and prepare the next generation to handle wealth well. We talk about raising children with money and how to rethink our own relationship with it after a successful exit. It's one of the most useful conversations I've had. Amy's views challenged my own. Amy, thank you so much for joining me today. You are one of very few people in the world who actually understands and can relate to the problems that my community and this audience finds probably the hardest one after a successful exit, which is the problem of how we deal with raising children with wealth. How do we not spoil them with wealth? How do we keep the family together? And you know all the answers, and I'm very excited to talk to you today. I've heard your talks before. There's so much value you can offer to my audience. So let's go ahead. May I ask you to first tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, absolutely. I've been so fortunate to have found the Williams Group about 15 years ago. Prior to that, I spent some time with Grant Thornton as a management consultant. We looked at family businesses, both large and small. In those conversations, we were asking questions like, should we keep it? Should we sell it? Questions like, are the right people in the right positions? Should we go to third-party management? I also had the honor of working with the Walt Disney Company. I was part of what they call the Disney University. And there we got to do things like, how do we develop a culture? How do we train a team? Are the right executives in the right positions? And what all of that experience has brought to me is a real sensitivity to who are we as a family, as a culture, as a business, and what are we committed to? What's our purpose? Educationally, I have a background in organizational psychology, and I got a master's in coaching. They call it somatic coaching through the Strozzi Institute. And it was through that journey that I met someone who was doing this work with the Williams Group, went out to meet Roy Williams and fell in love with the work and could see a really great loop for how it fits so perfectly with my background.
So you often stress that wealth goes beyond money, and it's also about values and responsibilities. If you can help us understand why it's so important for people like us who are first generation.
You know, I have to say, we did some research with over 3,000 families. The Williams Group has been around for 60 years. Started by Roy Williams, came out of the NFL. He played for the San Francisco 49ers. And when he came out, he looked around and he saw a lot of his peers who had come into significant wealth, but that wealth was dividing the family. Oftentimes they were losing control of the wealth through divorce or through bad investments. There was just not a lot of communication. So he wanted to know, why is that happening? These people can afford the best estate planners, tax accountants in the world. And yet still 70% of the families were finding an unsuccessful transition. And so the research revealed that of the 70% failure, 65% had to do with trust and communication, which is a very different
Oh, wow.
focus. Most families will put
Mm-hmm.
95% of their focus on estate planning. And
Mm-hmm.
estate planning is designed to take care of the assets, not the people. And so what was missing was
Mm-hmm.
this skill base of how do we become what I like to call relational Jedis, right? How do we get really good
Mm-hmm.
at managing the relationships, which is the foundation for everything?
Mm-hmm.
So 65% had to do with trust and communication. 25%
Mm-hmm.
had to do with heir preparedness. And for a lot of families, that means, you know what, let me teach them how to read a financial statement. Let's make sure they are
Mm-hmm.
financially literate. Let's send them to a boot camp. And there again, you've got the
Mm-hmm.
focus on the asset, not on who they are becoming. Why does their pillow come off or rather their head come off the pillow? And Roy, he was also famous for saying the two most important days in your life is the day you're born and the day you find out why. And so there we're looking at that very question. What are the values of our family? Who are we
Mm-hmm.
becoming? And we sort of flip that question from
Mm-hmm.
how much are you going to get to how are you going to contribute? Very different focus. And then lastly, I'll stop after this. The other third pillar that this research revealed had to do directly with values. 10% of the families did not have an aligned value
Mm-hmm.
structure, or they didn't even know what they were. The danger that a lot of families face is they start with those values and they say, you know what, let's just hit the pause button. Let's figure out what our values are. The challenge is if you haven't done the work
Mm-hmm.
on trust and communication so that you can have open and honest conversations, then those values tend to be built
Mm-hmm.
on a weak foundation. And you get something called cordial hypocrisy. You get a lot of people saying yes because it's not safe to say anything else. And so usually families that have built their values will come to us and say, we've done all this work, but we're still not able to
Mm-hmm.
navigate the conversations, or there's still not a lot of trust. And we just have to back up and do a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
that work on the front end. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I'm very intrigued now because now I have so many more questions. So the main one
Okay.
is that, okay, I just say I just had a liquidity event and I'm
Mhm.
overwhelmed with so many emotions. And you and I talked about this before. So much is going on. And one of the many issues is this worry that how do I make sure my children don't become these spoiled brats? How
Yeah.
would you go about this step by step in terms of timeline to make sure that we don't miss that moment when we should bring the kids into the conversation? Because obviously it sometimes takes a decade or more for adults to adjust to this new role of wealth and of managing wealth.
Do you know, I would say 30 is probably too late. I'd say even 20. It depends on the
Mm-hmm.
conversation that you're in. If you're in a conversation about how they're going to be a responsible steward, that's an asset conversation. That's a governance
Mm-hmm.
conversation. I would rather see the conversation focus even at a very young age, at 5 years old. It's okay,
Mm-hmm.
so what's your job today? Can you collect the napkins off the table? It's teaching them
Mm-hmm.
very early that their job is to contribute. What are the values
Mm-hmm.
of that family, about how they're organized? And we worked with a family where they said, you know, they'd pick the kids up from first grade, and the nannies and the moms would all be carrying all their backpacks. And the mom said to me, you know, in
Mm-hmm.
this family, we carry our own backpack. So her kid would be the one leaving the
Mm-hmm.
school last because he's carrying this heavy backpack. But that age, they're learning, oh, we have to be independent here. Another story from a famous family you'd recognize. She said, you know, I was hanging from the monkey bars and my aunt walked up to me and I was yelling, help, help, somebody get me down. I'm stuck. And the aunt said, well, what do you think you can do about this? So it invited
Mm-hmm.
her to solve the problem at a very young age. And so I think those are the tricks. If there was one hard and fast rule that I believe makes a huge difference, it's that these kids get a summer
Mm-hmm.
job as early as possible, any job, so
Mm-hmm.
that they are starting to gain some sensibility and sensitivity
Mm-hmm.
to what the world is like
Mm-hmm.
out there. So the
Mm-hmm.
the practices of the family make a difference.
So, how early should a family, in terms of children's age, should a family talk to the children about the wealth?
You know, we had a family where the kids were 6, 9, and 11, pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
we got into a conversation about what are they paying attention to? Like, if they
Mm-hmm.
what are their what are they learning about that has them concerned? The 6-year-old said, well, I heard about these turtles and they're eating way too much plastic. So I'd love to see if we could find a way to put those turtles in a hospital. So now the family gives to a turtle rehab facility and they have a conversation about it all the time. One of the other kids said, the teacher's always looking for supplies. We never have enough. And so now they make sure the schools
Mm-hmm.
have supplies. And someone else, well, I think it was the older one, saw someone in a wheelchair in front of the hospital. And they said, boy, I'd love to make sure there's healthcare. Not in these words, but in their own words. And so the conversation that family's in, this was a very wealthy family, multi-billion, and their first generation ended up in a divorce. So the mom was really struggling with who are these kids becoming and how are
Mm-hmm.
they going to grow up and be responsible contributors. So what she did was she just brings the conversation in. She manages all the philanthropy, but it's alive. It's hey, this is what we did today. Obviously, they can all have the
Mm-hmm.
save, the spend, the buckets that will help them um, understand these three pillars, right? The save, the spend, the give. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
We had another family where they flew private, landed somewhere beautiful. The 10-year-old daughter said, boy, I really want this item from a shop. And the dad said,
Mm-hmm.
great. If by the end of the week you have earned your allowance, you can have it. The friends they were with were in a
Mm-hmm.
state of shock. They said, wow, that's discipline. And he said, yeah, I'm really more committed to their character than the things they own. And so in that family, what's
Mm-hmm.
different is they have a regular conversation about who's driving, you or the wealth, right? Is the wealth driving this conversation or are you driving this conversation?
So, for
Yeah.
people who build their wealth through building a business, one of the most common fears, as you know, is that if the kids are not hungry themselves financially, they may not want to build value and contribute in that way, which is for most entrepreneurs is the most natural way to contribute, as opposed to, say, philanthropy, which is a very new type of activity at that point. So what would you say to that? Should we artificially create this financial hunger, or should we look for other motivations to develop in our children?
One of my clients once said to me, I can give my kids anything, but I can't give them desperation, right? I think that's what you're pointing to there. In our interpretation, what makes the most sense is uncovering a yearn, something that is motivating them from the inside, where they are compelled
Mm-hmm.
to action because they care about something. They care about
Mm-hmm.
something. They care about making a difference. They care about being a
Mm-hmm.
contribution. Many of the folks that we work with in first generation wealth, their children don't have to work. And so the conversation about how they're going to get a summer job seems absurd. And yet the skills that they're learning about how to contribute, how to make someone's day better, whether it's in food service or hospital, that quality of character is more important than the money they're earning. And then we've also found in our families of entrepreneurs that that quality of being able to see an opening in the market, how to fill a need, that's a skill that's learned because they've been in the conversation around the dinner table since they were born. And so inviting conversations like, how can you make this better? Or what do you see as missing? Or what's the opportunity? You know, my daughter, she's 27. My mother is in the hospital, and we're bringing her food because the hospital food is notoriously not great. And so my daughter said to me, you know, I think there's a business here. And so encouraging their articulation, what often gets missed is that mom and dad think they need to have all the answers. That when the kids come to them, that they need to solve the kids' problems. But if we reverse that and we teach mom and dad how to listen and how to ask great questions, it's pretty incredible what these kids will come up with on their own. So it's really finding that place where you can turn the conversation and hand it back to them.
So, Amy, I didn't know you when I first had to deal with with these issues with my kids. And I wonder how you would what your feedback would be with respect to some of the decisions I made, which I thought were maybe controversial. So, and please feel free to tell me I was totally stupid to do that. So one of them was that when my kids asked me about inheritance, which they did, I told them that I don't believe I can promise any money to anyone because money tends to come and go. And I don't feel I always have control over it. But what I can give them instead is the skill to earn money if they don't get any inheritance or if they lose money at some point in the future. Do you think it's a good approach to parenting?
I do. It borders on the cat and mouse game, right? Where we're always trying to hide the wealth. I think that your emphasis on who they are becoming and your commitment to family unity and their self sufficiency, I think those are essential messages to send. Where it gets tricky is maybe around 12 or 13. They figured out how to find the cost of the value of the home. Maybe they've got some ideas of what other businesses have sold for. They can put the pieces together for the family vacation. They see, oh, life has changed. We now have 3 houses and a chef. And so they're putting it together. And when you're not speaking to them about expectations, we start to build this quality of distrust. They don't trust you to transition it well. In your conversation, there's a lot of distrust in the market, a lot of uncertainty, and that's true. And then you're not really trusting that that their wealth won't derail their motivation. So we have these two pretty powerful forces of distrust already happening in the relationship.
If I came to you for advice before doing that, what would you recommend I do instead?
I would say, yes, we're wealthy, and you have a huge responsibility as part of this family. There's a certain quality of values that we have that we stand for. There's generational wealth opportunity here. The statistics are that you've got about a 70% chance of failure here. Every culture in the world has a saying for the third generation falling into poverty. So let's talk about how you're contributing and not worry about the number. The number will change. I think it's a powerful statement. My job as your mom is to make sure that you've got the skills to be successful in your own right. And no, I'm not prepared to tell you how much wealth there is. That's not a relevant conversation right here. I might then flip the conversation and say, why do you ask? What's your concern? When I interview these kids, their number one concern, and it's valid, is that gold bricks are going to land on their head and they are going to have to be responsible for an incredible amount of money, and they have no idea how to do that. Your comment is by the time that hope happens, God willing, you'll be prepared. You and I will be in a lot of conversation about what prepared looks like. I also have a team of people that will support you. They know how to do this. And so it's what you're doing in that conversation is you're opening the lines of communication that they will be supported and that this is a we conversation. It's not just you pulling the strings. It's how are they contributing? I have a family where they are also wealthy, very wealthy, and they have one of them has a passion for fishing. Recently, custom built a yacht. He had his, I think he was maybe 10, involved in all of the conversations on the phone with the people saying, how much does this cost? How much does this cost? So that son is learning not only about boat building, but how to ask the tough questions, how to really assess, is it worth putting that kind of thing in this boat or not? So they are included all the way through the process. Yeah, there's a lot of wealth there, but not something that needs to be hidden. The other thing that I see happen is these kids are in college and they're not comfortable with their wealth. And so they recurrently pay for the Uber. They buy their friends lunch. They pick up a tab at the bar. And it's because they're struggling in this way that everybody knows they are wealthy, perhaps the wealthiest in the room. They feel obligated because they don't know how to be comfortable with the wealth. There hasn't been a conversation with them about how this is generational wealth, about how they have a responsibility to be a good steward and learn how to say no, and how to have long eyes on this wealth, right? It's not mine to manage yet, guys. I'm only responsible for what they give me. And so no, who can Venmo me some cash here? So it's learning how to have those conversations with your kids.
How would you go about learning kids to say no, especially given that it's one of the biggest challenges for adults themselves? As you know, it's a very common conversation we have, first generation people. How do we say no? But how do we also help kids to do that? Because they're talking to different type of people as well.
So when you have to say no, what goes on in your mind when you say no to something? That's a real question for you.
Well, what helped me personally was flipping it to what I say yes to. And now it's already a habit, but in the beginning, it was actually a bit tricky, but I was basically saying yes to the peace of mind and to saving that relationship, because I did make a few mistakes in the beginning, as many do, and I wasn't able to say no. And that really destroyed relationships and became very painful. So I flipped it to first remember that feeling. I bottled it, and I remember that feeling of how it was not worth it, destroying the relationships, but also I was saying yes to peace of mind.
Do you know, if they're clear on the purpose of the wealth, if they're clear on who they are as a human being, it's easier for them to say no. So in the Uber, when they're all driving somewhere, if there's already been a conversation with their parents about, hey, what it looks like for you and I to be a responsible steward, you're not just you're not saying yes to everything. You are able to say, no, guys, this isn't actually my wealth. This is generational wealth. My job, I have a responsibility to be a good steward here. And so who's going to Venmo me? Or, hey guys, it's not my wealth. It's really mom and dad's. I need to make my own. So fork it over, right? So in the I need to make my own way, they have they have a vision, and they're compelled to preserve that. They have a purpose for saying no. Also, saying no in our world is a way of taking care of the relationship. So if they build the practice of always being the one that says yes, they're building resentment. And so ultimately they'll break up with those friends because they are uncomfortable in the relationship. So it might sound like something like, hey guys, I got dinner last time. Can someone else get it this time? So how do they make an effective request? Yeah. And those conversations should be happening regularly. We had a situation where the daughter was at Stanford and she was, there was an expectation in the family that she would work while she was there. And she took a job in the school newspaper, but felt really guilty about it because there were other kids that would only get financial assistance if they had a job. And she was taking one of those jobs. She didn't need the financial assistance. So she was upset about it, and she was starting to isolate at school. She finally brought the conversation up in a family meeting, and the mom said, I got it. In this instance, it's okay if you don't work for the school newspaper. What other stretch assignments can you do? What else can you be? How else can you be a contribution at the school? Maybe you don't get paid, but what we're after is, are you learning how to report news? Are you learning how to write? Where's the opening you see that the school isn't already addressing? So it wasn't about just saying no to the job. It was about, okay, what else can we do? I got it. But it had to be a conversation, which opened up the daughter to a whole new space of possibilities that she could explore. Sounds a little like entrepreneurialism, if you ask me.
Someone, a good friend of mine, is dealing with an interesting issue. I'd love to hear your perspective on it. So he's in his early 30s, and his father passed away, and the guy inherited a substantial wealth. And that family did take care of preparing him for the wealth. But by the time he reached maybe 33, he realized that he actually would much have preferred his father to teach him how to be an entrepreneur, because he realized that he did not have the skills that his father had, and he wished he had. So he actually is not very happy with being prepared to just be a steward of wealth.
He didn't have the skills to think about how to make decisions the way his dad did. Is that accurate?
Yeah, his problem is he wishes he could create value and not just be a steward of wealth.
Is what I hear so often from these kids is they want to sit down and be part of the conversation before it's too late, right? When mom and dad are on the other side of the daisies, it's very hard to have a good conversation with them other than a Ouija board. And I don't think we want to leave or put the risk of the wealth in the hands of a Ouija board. And so the more mom and dad can invite these kids into conversations about how to think about things, what's their thought process? How do they decide whether or not they can trust an advisor? How do they decide if something's worth an investment or not? And what I find is always so amazing is that the families we have the honor and the privilege of working with, the matriarch and the patriarch are not wired like the rest of the world. They look at things differently. And so teaching the kids to fish, how do we think about these situations, including them in those conversations, is really powerful. And for some moms and dads, it's an uncomfortable place because they don't know the answer always, right? But learning how to make mistakes is also a valuable lesson for these kids.
Would you recommend to these families to inspire the children to follow the entrepreneurial path? I'm talking about children of entrepreneurs.
I think in a world where parents are always asking us, what questions should I be asking now? How do I open these conversations? Where do I start? I would like to suggest that start at the very beginning. I might even say, guys, what do you think we're wealthy? And see what they say. I think it's also a great conversation to say, hey, what's important to you? What impact would you like this wealth to have in the world and in your life? Right? If you were in my shoes raising kids, what impact would you like it to have? That's a really important question. Obviously, the question I mentioned earlier, in what way do you see you could be a contribution to the wealth? That would be useful. In what way do you see you can help grow it? I don't mean through investments, but when we talk about this word wealth, it means so much more than money. It means education. It means our network. It means our identity. So, what ways do you see you can contribute there? I also think it's a useful conversation to simply say, when we don't agree, how do we want to work through that? What suggestions do you have as the next gen that when we hit these places where we might not be on the same page, what's your recommendation on how we work through that? You'll be surprised at the wisdom these kids can bring to the table. They really, most often, just want to be heard.
So say a family came into wealth when kids are already older, say, 13, 14, like this dangerous early teen age. And by that time, there was no preparation done for wealth. How do you deal with those families?
Yeah. Oftentimes it's really getting everybody on the same page that we really do have something to work on. In other words, what we see happen in families is everybody else is pointing a finger at somebody else. Like, no, it's their problem. They don't communicate. They run away. Just the other day, I was with a family and there was an interpretation that the brother is somebody who just doesn't care. And then when I got into a conversation with the son, he said, no, I care deeply. It's just that I don't have the skills to have a good conversation and be afraid I'm going to make things worse. And then I said, so where did you learn that? And he said, my dad does the same thing. And so that pattern, if I were to ask his dad where he learned how to run away from conflict, he would say, my dad taught me. So we don't just inherit wealth, we inherit these communication practices. And truthfully, that's all they are. There's not too many quotes of Aristotle that I can think of, but there is one that I remember, and it says, we are what we practice, and we're practicing all the time. And so for families that have reached this point where maybe the kids aren't responding to texts as often as they used to, or they seem disconnected and they don't want to show up at a family meeting, or mom and dad are afraid to have a conversation with them directly, so they go through the advisor to have that. Those are all what we'd call red flags and maybe yellow flags, right? A yellow flag might be lack of direction, or there's more joking and banter than there is honest communication. There's this current of behavior that's bordering on entitlement as a standard in the family. The kids might be jockeying for position, like who's going to be mom's favorite or dad's favorite, or who's going to get the top job at the family business. So all of those little flags, we would say, are opportunities for the family to say, okay, let's hit the pause button. We happen to have an assessment that's based on our research of the 3,000 families, where we can say, what's your likelihood of success based on the 3 core variables that we know successful families do well. The first is trust and communication. They know how to have a difficult conversation and have it go well. The second is heir preparedness. They have the same standards for what it means to be a prepared heir. That doesn't mean they know how to balance the checkbook. It means they know who they're becoming. And then the third piece is we're all on the same page about what our values and purpose is of the wealth, the purpose of the wealth. So we can benchmark a family in terms of the likelihood of success for those 3 core variables. Once we've got everybody saying, okay, yeah, this I think is worth an exploration, We then bring everybody together for the first family meeting. And in that meeting, we are not talking about how much they're going to get and when. We're not even talking about how much wealth there is today, or even the different divisions of the company, or what happened in the sale. All of that is asset related. We're talking about, how do we have a difficult conversation and have it go productively? What do we mean by this word trust? What do we do when we feel that judgment? What happens when we want to say something to mom and dad, but we self-edit? Why are we stopping the conversation? So we do a lot of work on how to become what we call relational Jedis. How do we get really good at managing relationships? Because communication is built on relationships. Wealth transition is built on communication. So we have to back it up a little bit and say, how do we speak truth to power? How do we navigate conflict productively? How do we build, manage, and repair trust if trust has been broken? We worked with a family where there was, they made quite a bit of wealth. They sold the business. It's a name you might recognize, first generation. 3 kids, 2 were in their 30s. 1 got married. The other was trying to figure out a path forward, working, but not really enjoying his work. And then the youngest one was playing way too many video games in the basement. And I'll put him at about 23. So we have the first family meeting, and the 23-year-old doesn't even show up. And so I called him, because we interview everybody before the meeting. And I say, hey, what's going on? And he said, I don't think it's worth it. What's not worth it? I said. He said, every time I show up at a family meeting or in some family conversation, everybody tells me why I can't do what I want to do. Because I'm the youngest, everybody tells me what to do, and nobody listens. And then when they do listen, they shoot the idea down. So you know what? I'm good in the basement. I got a great dog. Maybe I'll pick up a hobby, but I'm okay. So not okay with the rest of the family. So I say, okay, come to the meeting tomorrow and let's have a conversation about that. And he said, what? I said, how nobody listens to you. So he shows up. We put him at the front of the room. We say, hey, if conversations were happening more productively for you in this family, what would that look like? And he said, oh, well, people wouldn't shoot my ideas down, or they wouldn't tell me why I can't do things, or they wouldn't tell me what I should be doing. And then I said, so if there was something you could do right now that you'd like to give it a shot, he said, real estate. And everybody said, they did what they do. They said, no way, we've never done real estate. We only know people who lost a lot of money in real estate. We don't have any background in that. We don't even know people in that whole thing. And I go, okay, time out. That's the pattern. So then the spouse at the end of the meeting said to this guy, hey, you know what? I'm in construction. If you want to come and walk around the site, see who you can meet, maybe you can shadow someone, come on down. About 5 years later, that kid and his son are doing some really exciting real estate deals together. So the breakdown wasn't that he didn't have motivation or that he was entitled. That was the assessment that people had about him, but it wasn't true. People think their assessments are truth, and that is really where the division starts to happen. So the opportunity was naming the dynamic and then inviting the family to solve it themselves. We're coaches, not psychologists. There is a really valid place for psychologists in these families. Often that work has to do with the past. How do we reframe the past? Our work as coaches is very different in that we're looking at, what are the skills? What can we now learn that we didn't have in our toolbox before? And where do we want to go? How are those skills going to get us where we want to go? So as coaches, we're not in there doing it for them. We're teaching them how to do it themselves. So that's a big difference. When we work with a family, it's really about skill development more than anything else.
Yeah. That's brilliant, because I find the same problem in all areas of our lives when we suddenly become exited founders, and we have to deal with wealth and this whole new world. And of
Yeah.
course, dealing with the family also requires skills. And most of us don't appreciate it because we think we have all the skills,
Right.
but we don't.
Yeah.
We don't, and we
It's
learn
so
the hard
true.
way. But Amy, let's talk about another scenario. So a family in their early 40s and kids are still young, and suddenly a company is sold, and the father, let's say father because it's just more typical, is suddenly at home, very willing to be there for the family, very hungry for that kind of connection that he didn't have before. And that usually triggers lots of different questions. How do we now raise these kids? And we feel this responsibility. They're still small. How do we do it right to avoid exactly the scenario you described to me before, when the kids are already adult and you have to address it later? What would you tell a family like this in terms of the steps they should be taking?
So the steps they should be taking to, let me make sure I understand your question, to reconnect with the children?
No, they to make sure that the family is not negatively affected by the wealth.
Yeah.
And also now we're talking about a situation when both parents, which is very typical for my audience, are at home very willing to do it right,
Yes.
but not having the skills from their own past naturally.
Right. Yeah. So there's two aspects to your question that's interesting. One is what they're doing, and the other is who they're being while they're doing what they're doing.
Okay.
And
I like
so,
that.
and I think the fundamental piece that kids pay attention to is how they feel when they're around their parents, right? And so if mom or dad, let's say they built a great business, they sold the business, and now they're wondering, well, what's my next Mount Everest, right? The joy of that pursuit, the joy of building up something again. Including the kids in those conversations about, hey, what brings you joy? About what's exciting to you about what just happened with this business? So the first step in my world is really having those open and honest conversations about what they now see as possible that they didn't see before. It's almost like treating the kids as adults and taking the money hat off, taking the coach hat off, and having a really honest conversation about, here's what brought me joy, here's what I'm excited about, this is what I would like for you. So step one is really going for a walk and having an honest conversation where the hearts are facing in the same direction, and not so much talking about what you've done or how much money you've made, but the contribution it has been, how it brought you joy. Because in those conversations, you're starting to build a sense of the values and the character that's really fundamental to who these kids are becoming. Sometimes it's useful for families to talk about their parents. What are the values? What drove them to build this business? What are they most excited about? And have a conversation on that level, not on what they're doing. The other thing I would do is I would really look for places where they could start building more skill around how to have good conversations, around how to build, repair, manage relationships. If I had one piece of advice, the number one thing that I see in every family is when there's a bit of tension, people start to distrust the intention of each other. They start to think, oh, dad doesn't trust me, so I'm not going to talk to him. Or dad thinks, I try to get my kids' attention to go out to dinner and they keep blowing me off. So they must not want to be around me. So they distrust each other's intention. And the breakdown there is that it's a false assessment. It's a false interpretation of what's going on. And so when they can look at the tip of the spear and say, hey, you know what, son? I often text and invite us to go spend some time together, but it feels like you're always busy. Do you have any suggestions on how we could spend some time together, or what's happening there? Right? So you name the dynamic. You go straight into the tip of the spear and you say how it is for you. Here's my experience. Is there a way we could find a way to spend some time together? And so I think it's talking about what brings you joy. I think it's naming the dynamic as a second level piece. And then it's building the skill. It's learning new conversational Jedi moves that maybe you don't already have in the toolbox. That's probably the trickiest part of our work, Anastasia, is that people come to us and they're already wildly successful. So they're like, well, what do I have to learn about communication? I'm already an expert. But the truth is, as the wealth grows and the family expands and the kids get older and things get more complex, you need a new skill set. The same the same skills that built the wealth are not the same skills that give it away or transition it. That's a whole different skill set. And the families who successfully transition wealth, ones that do this well, they take the time and make the investment on saying, hey, how can we become a high performing family team? What else can we learn about how we coordinate action together? How do we manage our mood around each other? How do we manage judgment? What could have us go from being a great family to an even better family, right? So that we have more confidence that this wealth is not going to divide us. Every family that ends up in a divided situation did not take the time to learn these skills. And that's just a fact.
Yeah. So Amy, a rather typical situation happens with younger exited founders, because these days, especially in the technology world, we have people who exit in their 30s, and it's common, early 40s as well. So these people often want to go back to building, go back to business. And they face a dilemma because they feel guilty that they haven't been there for their children for years while building the first business.
Right.
Yet they have this yearning to, do it again because they're still very young and full of energy and they're interested, and maybe their genuine motivation has transitioned to this desire to contribute to the world, and it's painful not to. So the dilemma is very complicated. And part of that dilemma also is the fact that these people want to model hard work and the desire to contribute to their kids through work. So how would you advise someone like that who doesn't want to go through another stage of not seeing their family for years, but wants to integrate the family life and business in a wiser way second time around?
Yeah, I mean, that really is a question of balance. And the way that we stay balanced is we keep our attention on what we care about, right? So there's this place where I care about building another business that brings me joy. And I learned the first time around that I want to do that in a way that I don't break relationship with those that love me most. There was a 23-year-old or 24-year-old that said to Warren Buffett, what's the one lesson you really learned through all of this process of building all this wealth? And Warren Buffett said, it's that those who you want to have love you at the end of the day, right? And so in those moments where mom and dad are making a decision to go to a board meeting instead of somebody's baseball game, that's the place to go, what am I committed to here? What do I really want to take care of? So the wealth may not grow at the same speed, or maybe it will. Maybe it'll grow even faster because they're moving from a place of center. They're making decisions on their terms, not in the wild chase for more. We often in the tiger meetings will go around the room and say, what's the purpose of your wealth, guys? What are you organizing around as you're building it? 9 out of 10 times they say making more, right? Making more. That it's the chase of bringing in more money, building a bigger portfolio. That's the purpose.
Mhm.
And so then the next question you can guess is, well, what's the cost of that?
Mhm.
Right? It's nearly, let me say, I'd say 80% of the families, somewhere in
Mhm.
there's a conversation where mom or dad are apologizing for not
Mhm.
being present while the kids
Mhm.
were growing up. We had a family where the dad said, I don't get why my kids don't want to hang out with me. They're 28, 30. They live next door, but I never see them.
Mhm.
And I said, well, do you take them on vacation? He said, yeah, we all went to London. And I said, what percentage of your time while you were in London were you on your phone? He said, I got it. Right. Right. And so it
Mhm.
really is, it comes down to what am I committed to?
But in terms of the balance between the desire to model hard work and contribution through entrepreneurship and being there
Yeah.
for the kids, because I think
Yeah.
for many people in our community, that's the real question. It's not actually the question of making
Yeah.
more money. It's the question
Yeah.
of, I found my purpose. I want my kids to share the value and see what it means. But how
To
do
work
I
hard.
do that if I'm not fully committed?
Right. I think you're asking the question, what does fully committed look like in this family? I
Mm-hmm.
interview many kids that have anorexia, that are on medication to manage anxiety and depression, that are um, turning towards technology as an escape. Every one of those kids have worked themselves to the bone trying to
Mm-hmm.
recreate or get their parents' attention by
Mm-hmm.
working exceptionally hard. Just last night, had a conversation with a globally recognized physician,
Mm-hmm.
and he's concerned that his son, who works in the investment banking world, is working too hard,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's more important to model the balance. That's what they want to pay attention to. That in the place of where the kid, there's an interpretation and assessment that the child's not working hard enough. That's a conversation, because our generation grew up with, hey, shoulder to the wheel, work harder, put in the
Mm-hmm.
hours, make it FaceTime, make it matter. Where today, Chat GPT can save people an awful lot of time. There is a way that technology is saving time. There is a way
Mm-hmm.
that these kids have learned just by growing up with technology how to use networks. Many of them looks like they're working part-time, but they're in the gig economy and they have 4 or 5 different revenue streams.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does working hard really mean? At what cost? So, to
Mm-hmm.
balance it, it's really, yeah, mom and dad have to set the standard, but it's also a conversation. Is it about the hours or is it about the impact? And is it about impact or is it about efficiency? So, really having conversations about those aspects, at those
Mm-hmm.
levers of productivity that I think are really important.
So you mentioned that you ask people in particular in Tiger 21 meetings about the purpose of wealth. In your
Yeah.
experience, those families who are successful in handling wealth as a family, what
Mhm.
their purpose of wealth commonly is?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we work with families, we get to that point after we've done some work of these skills and we've worked on actual live conversations that the family wants to have using those skills, right? Because we know that unless we're practicing, we're not really learning. We eventually get to that place where we look at the values and we look at the mission statement for a family. Nearly
Mm-hmm.
every family has some of the same pieces. It's education, it's um, family unity
Mm-hmm.
as the purpose. It's generation, like caring about the future of where everybody's going. Um, it is um, philanthropy might be in there. growing the wealth might be in there. So it's not usually one purpose. It might be a paragraph that has a few aspects of here's what we care about as a family. Then the work is really how are we living that mission? So, for example, we had a family where um, one of the kids had a child that required special education, an infant, and she wanted to hire a French speaking nanny so that the mental development would start to expand and they'd learn not just French, but they'd have a better shot at having more linguistic capability. She went back to the family because at this point, when you build these family mission statements, it's not just mom and dad making those decisions. Now the whole family makes those decisions. And she said, I would like a certain amount of distribution every year so that I could afford the French speaking nanny. And the kids all sat back and they said, boy, you know what? We have decided that what education means in this family is that it's accredited, it's got a fixed amount of time, that it's a certain GPA, that it's a coach ticket back and forth. It could be technical, but it's accredited. A French speaking nanny doesn't fit in that. So as far as we're concerned, we don't see that kind of education warrants a family funded distribution. And so, maybe this is a conversation she has with her father about how to handle this situation, but it's not something that the family says, hey, that's not what we mean by the values of this family. It's not what we mean by education. So the important point that I'm making here is that when you build out this purpose, that you have action items and it's a recurring North Star, you come back to that paragraph to say, how should we make decisions here? We worked with another family where the mom thought the purpose of the wealth was to put it into a foundation. And she said, I would love for the kids to run the foundation together. And so we said, great, let's interview the kids. And of course, one is a fisherman and he works very hard and he is a devout Catholic and really uses very little of the family wealth and invests what he does have. His sister, on the other hand, is a volunteer at an LGBTQ facility that she runs and more than happy to use the family wealth and really an atheist. And so those two work together to say, you know what, our values are so incredibly different. There's no way that we could make decisions together. And so through the process of learning how to have meaningful conversations, how to address some of the tension that was happening in the family, they ultimately realized that what they are both committed to is young people. The son wanted to do missionary work and the daughter wanted to fund suicide hotlines. And so as they explored what really mattered to them, what they cared about, they realized they have very common values. They're just expressed differently. So they ended up hiring a third party to run the foundation, but they come together every 6 months to talk about what they're up to. Today, the daughter got married and she invited her brother to be the godfather of her child. So it may look like a family is far apart, but actually, if you really get underneath the trust and communication, you find out the values are very similar. And then you can start living them by paying attention to them.
So, Amy, these successful families, how do they go about allowances?
That's really different for every family. In some families, it's a fixed number by taking care of certain chores. In other families, it might be matched. If you save this much, I'll match it. Or if you make this much, it's milestones in other families. Like if you get a certain GPA, you get X amount. If you get promoted in a year, you get X amount. So some families, they'll have a investment portfolio and they'll say, let's meet as a family to talk about how we're investing and how we think about that. And as that grows, I'll match it. So there's lots of different ways. It's not it's really something that's best organized from within as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to some model laid on top of the family. And I want to make that point, Anastasia, that many times families will come to us. They've worked with some of the best consulting companies out there and they've put in
Mm-hmm.
state of the art governance. The
Mm-hmm.
challenge and why they come to us is that they can't execute the governance because they
Mm-hmm.
don't know how to have the conversations in a
I
way
see.
that are
Mm-hmm.
productive. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
like, here's the solution. It's more like, how do we, you say to the kids, guys, I'd love to incentivize you. What would be meaningful for you? We had
Mm-hmm.
another family, what meaningful for them was a trip to Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't money at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it usually isn't money, to be honest.
So a very wise man who has 6 adult children and they have amazing relationship in their family once gave me an advice which I have been using successfully for a few years now with my older kids. And the advice was that it's very important to know when you switch from a parent to a mentor. And I'm very curious how you feel about that. And
Do you know, I love the question because a long time ago, my mom, and still today, talks about Chaim Janot, a psychologist that she read about while she was raising us. And
mhm,
the mantra was treat your kids as adults. And so for us, it's useful when you can name the hat that you're wearing. As your
mhm,
mother, I'm going to say this. As a advisor, I'm going to say this. As a friend, I'll say this. And
mhm,
so naming the hat that you're wearing is a really powerful way
mhm,
to align the relationship or create a context there. So in
mhm,
families where the children work in the family business, important especially for the parents to be able to say, hey, as the business owner, this is the way this needs to be. As
mhm,
your mother, I'm concerned that you're not showing up on time. What worries me about that is the identity that you're creating.
mhm.
But that's speaking as your mother. As the head of the business, hey, you're late to another meeting, we're going to have to dock your pay. So it's a
Mhm.
different conversation depending on what hat you're wearing, but naming the hat is
I
important.
like that. That's really cool. I'll use that.
Okay, good.
So
Good.
you've mentioned mission statement as something that you consider very important. How
Yeah.
should families think about mission statements, and why is it important?
Well, the way to think about them is that they should be based on the family values. So a mission statement is not unlike a mission statement for a family business. This just happens to be for a family. So
Mhm,
it creates the North Star for how the family is going to make decisions. It's built on everyone's values. For us, that process is actually 2 days. We spend the first day on 5 core areas:
mhm,
psychology, intellectual, financial, social, and I can't think of what the other one is. But there's these 5 core values,
mhm,
and we invite everyone, spouses. The most of our families, the kids are over the age of 16 minimally, but
mhm,
each person has an opportunity to answer some really great questions in these 5 domains to learn how they see the world, to express what matters to them in those domains. And when the whole family hears it, they start to build a strong foundation of where the common areas are.
mhm,
Honestly, 99% of them are common. They're just expressed differently.
mhm,
So
mhm,
then they build this mission statement based on those values. And then that key piece is, okay, great, we've got this beautiful mission statement, and here it is on a beautiful color image. But what are
mhm.
we going to do? How are we going to live it? So,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, a lot of families will put family unity in their mission statement. Then it
Mhm,
becomes a question of, what does that mean? How are we
mhm,
going to live family unity? I've heard everything from, hey, no more criticism in the family. criticism is unacceptable and it's not going to happen, to we're going to take a wild vacation every year and each of us are going to have a chance to name where we're going to go, paid for by the family. So then it becomes great. Does that mean nannies are included? Who pays for the nanny? Does that mean, is that money coming out of the trust fund or is it funded independently? What happens if you can't stay the whole time? Is it obligatory? What happens when we're there? Do we have to show up for every family dinner? Or is this something? So how do we actually live what we're trying to create? And if you listen, all of those questions require a certain amount of skill to coordinate action as a family. How do we speak truth to power? How do we have my voice heard? How do I carve my own path inside this family?
Brilliant.
We have a program that we're launching now. It's called the Next Gen Leaders program. And it's pretty exciting because in this instance, we're working with just the next gen across multiple families. So they're able to have these conversations about who am I becoming? Is my voice heard? How am I carving my own path? How am I leading the company differently from my father? How am I creating a name for myself? How do I invite others into that vision? Those skills that we teach with families are super important, but when we bring the kids, the next gen, together and they have an opportunity to learn from each other without the influence of mom and dad in the room, it's an extremely powerful opportunity for them to gain those skills and to build their own network with other wealthy next gen family members.
I think it's a great idea. So it's a group exercise.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
I love it.
When we do it with families, we include the spouses and the kids over the age of 16. Yeah, it's very powerful practice for them. It sheds a light on the values that have created the wealth. What's different is before this process, those values were operating in the background. But once we identify them, now we can name them, we can observe them, we can manage them, we can have conversations about them. And that is really what makes the difference.
Amy, what are some of the most common and the most dangerous mistakes that people do?
Great question. I think the most dangerous mistake is not talking about the fact that you're wealthy. That cat and mouse game of hiding it only builds distrust over time. I think the second mistake is people talking about how much money they have before there's a strong relationship that's built. Because once that cat's out of the bag, it's very hard to put it back in. Honestly, I personally don't think that they need a number. I think they need a neighborhood, maybe to say, yeah, we have generational wealth here and it's a big opportunity. And then I would say to them, hey, what does prepared look like to you? For you to have a sense of how to contribute to something like this, what do you think is important? So that leads me to the third mistake is not asking the next gen questions, right? So they come to you and they say, hey, how much money am I going to get and when am I going to get it? That's the moment to say, hey, that's the wrong question. How do you flip the question and say, how do you see you could be a contribution here? I would say another mistake is focusing on being right, not being in relationship. So if you look at the construct of conversation, when mom and dad come across as certain, that will usually drive the next gen into pretense, like it's not worth the conversation here. Like the kid who didn't show up for the family meeting, they just sort of give up and they quit. And the relationship gets further and further, and there's less and less opportunity for meaningful conversation. The only way to shift that is to go into a conversational space where you're asking questions. You're curious, not critical, right? You're asking about perspectives. Why does that matter to you? Tell me what's important. What am I not hearing that you want me to hear? And when mom and dad can shift from certainty to getting into this place of exploration and curiosity, then we have a whole different conversation happening. Then people feel like they matter, and they
Yeah.
feel like what they care about matters. That is a whole different conversation that leads to a level of connection in families that's heartfelt.
Do you feel it's important to have regular scheduled meetings for the family?
I do. I think that they should be annual for sure. The mistake families make is that those meetings are one direction, top down, and they focus on assets. They don't focus on the people or what people really care about. To build a good family meeting agenda, I would interview each family member and say, hey, if you were going to lead this meeting, what would you want to make sure is on the agenda? So the mistake is the conversations are in these family meetings are one directional, and they're too focused on assets.
Amy, thank you so much. This has been so amazing, really, really valuable. Is there anything else you feel you would love to share with my audience that maybe we haven't touched upon?
If you were to ask me, what's the common theme that allows families to shift from being uncertain about the impact of wealth on the family to having more confidence or trust that it's going to go well? It's that they've learned the skills to have conversations so that they can trust themselves in the conversation. In other words, these skills become embedded and part of a new fabric, so that when they're in that place where they feel obligated to do something or take some action or pay for the Uber or to say yes when they want to say no, they have a toolkit available to them that lets them say, no, actually, I'm not going to go to the board meeting. I'm going to go to the game. So they've learned how to trust themselves to manage the relationships from a place of care. Yeah. Who they are becoming, who they are being for their family members is a bigger conversation than what they're doing.
Amy, are there any books or people to follow besides you, obviously, and I will include links to all your work, that you would recommend to people in our situation?
There are so many great books out there, and there's new ones being written every day. I do think that obviously our book, Bridging Generations, is one of the best because it gives actual family examples, and it talks about ways families can start to manage these conversations. They can get them started on their own. There's a number. Jay Hughes has done some great work. One of the Bibles for him is Family Wealth, Keeping It All in the Family. I think that book is one of the best out there. He also wrote another book called The Complete Family Wealth. Wealth is Well-Being. I think that one is good. Long time ago, a guy named Charles Collier wrote a book called Wealth and Families. And I know that's one of the early books right out there with Preparing Heirs from Roy Williams. So I would take a look at some of those, but there's enough out there you can find. They're all good.
Yeah, that's the
being
problem. They're not
proactive.
all good. They're not all good. It's never the
no.
case, right?
I suppose there are many that are better than others. Yeah.
We're not going to read dozens, but
No.
it's very helpful hearing from you which ones actually are worth reading. This is very
You're
helpful.
welcome. My favorite part about doing these podcasts is our work. What what we love about this work is that we have the opportunity to keep great families together so that their wealth can be a force for good in the world. And the fact that families are increasingly reading about this, how now that I've done this great work of preparing assets for the family, how do I get educated on preparing the family for the assets? To be proactive in that conversation is vital. And it's just, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak on that level. Just to, if one of your listeners gets proactive about how to prepare their kids, I know we've done good work here.
No, absolutely. Amy, thank you so much again for your time and sharing your wisdom so generously.
You're
You all
very
need it.
welcome. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.